All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer, the views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode.
Hey everyone, before we get into it today, just want to give a quick shout out to this season's sponsor, Rook. Close to $1 billion worth of MEV has been taken out of users' pockets, and that's just on Ethereum, and that number is only getting larger, unfortunately. Rook thinks that it's time for a change, and they've built a solution which is going to automatically redirect that MEV back to where it belongs, into the user's pocket. So you're going to be hearing all about them later in the show. I'm a huge fan of this team and what they're building, so stay tuned to find out more.
Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Today, unfortunately, Hasu is not with us. He's doing enjoying some well-deserved vacation, but we're going to do our best to hold around without him here. And I'm joined to talk about MEV on the Cosmos. And today I'm joined by Barry Plunkett of Skip Protocol and Henry de Valence of Penumbra. Guys, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us, Michael.
So maybe before we dive in, I would love if you guys could just give a quick 30-second intro of who you both are and the projects that you're working on. And maybe, Barry, I can call on you to start.
Yeah. My name is Barry Plunkett. I'm one of the co-founders of Skip. We build a variety of MEV infrastructure and protocols for Cosmos blockchains in particular, and app chains and rollups in general, to try to help them regain and maintain control over their MEV supply chains and make decisions about what kinds of MEV can and can't be extracted, and how and who extracts it, and where that revenue goes.
So my name is Henry. I'm the founder of Penumbra. So Penumbra is building shielded DEX and also an interchain privacy layer. And what's interesting about it is it's sort of also an experiment to see like what is like one possible point in the design space of useful blockchains with privacy. Not trying to start with here's this fully general thing, but what's this one specific application, trading, where privacy has some kind of real world quantifiable value to the product. And then generalizing from that, what lessons you can learn for, what should the future of privacy blockchains be.
Excellent, guys. Thanks very much. Now, maybe just to kick things off, as I mentioned before, and as listeners to previous episodes in the season will know, we've largely been exploring MEV through the perspective of an Ethereum native, or how MEV gets done on Ethereum. Maybe, Barry, I could call on you first here. I know that at one point you were a searcher in Ethereum, and I know that some of the philosophical differences that you had with how MEV was being pursued on Ethereum made you move to Cosmos. So maybe if you could just fill us in with that backstory and what made you kind of start building Skip.
So I did used to search in Ethereum back in 2020, 2021. I had brief periods of time where I was quite successful with my co-founder, and probably longer periods of time where I was less successful or getting out competed. But the experience of searching there, on one hand, I think really impressed me with just the sophistication and the depth of the MEV supply chain on Ethereum, in terms of the number of different kinds of actors who are participating in the space, and just the lengths that they're going to try to squeeze out as much MEV as possible as they can. But we got pretty disillusioned with what we were seeing, just in terms of the ecosystem progressively moving in that direction of maximal extraction all the time as the guiding philosophy. I think from our perspective, it's something that made a lot of sense for Ethereum. It's a massively decentralized community and the protocol itself can be very hard to change, both socially and technically, given how much value is being secured by it at all times, and how many people are building huge variety of different things on top of it. But we thought that there was an opportunity to explore the MEV design space from a very different perspective, where instead of saying, okay, because we have this decentralized community, because we have this relatively static protocol, we have to evolve in the direction of trying to create a fully off-chain supply chain for MEV extraction that has no guiding principle beyond we should try to maximize extraction and we should try to democratize our ability to do that. We thought there was a lot of opportunities to be more opinionated, especially, some of the stuff that upset us early on was a lot of the front running and sandwich stuff that we were seeing. I mean, we didn't do any of that ourselves, and I come from a traditional finance background, and so seeing that, it looked like market manipulation, and it didn't look like the kind of thing that legally I would be willing or excited to do. And so we set off to look for other places where we could explore what MEV infrastructure could look like, and we found Cosmos, where a lot of these constraints that the Ethereum ecosystem has of having massive decentralization, having to support tens of thousands of validators running on commodity hardware, having a very inflexible protocol layer didn't exist. And you had people running really cool experiments about, how they were building all the different layers of the stack, from consensus all the way up through how smart contracts work and the things smart contracts are and aren't allowed to do, and how accounts work. And so we found a home there for what we call sovereign MEV, which we can get into more, but at a high level is the protocol should be opinionated, and the protocol can be opinionated about how MEV works, and we want to try to build tooling that helps them express those opinions.
Yeah, that's a super helpful explanation, and I want to just bookmark this idea of sovereign MEV and the idea of having an opinion on MEV for a discussion about cross-domain MEV later. But two of the design principles that I've heard you talk about, Barry, that are in Ethereum, both are concerned with the validator, and they're kind of polar opposite in Cosmos, at least from my perspective currently. So I feel like kind of the 2 points that the MEV supply chain on Ethereum are optimized for is commoditizing the validator and paying the validator as much money as possible, basically making sure all of those funds flow to the validator for the security budget of Ethereum, but also making sure that no validator, from a large pool or something like that, can have an advantage over the little guy per se. And in Cosmos, it can be very different, right? So you hear this coming from Osmosis quite a bit, but there's kind of this mentality of what can your validator do for you? Because one of the key differences in Cosmos is validators run consensus, so kind of Tendermint consensus, but also the application code as well. So can you just kind of unpack that difference and maybe the design space that opens up for sovereign protocols?
Yeah. It's a great question. So when to go back to your point, it seems like, at least from an outsider's perspective, that the design of Ethereum's MEV supply chain, especially focused on PBS and MEV Boost, was largely built to try to maximize extraction and at the same time minimize the required intelligence and participation of validators in that extraction. So builders and relayers take responsibility for coming up with valuable blocks and forwarding them to the validator and ensuring that they are okay and that they extract as much as possible. And all the validator does is it just signs some blinded header and says, trust the relayer that they've done a good job simulating things and picking the highest block from their set of builders. And that's to your point, because you need to support tens of thousands of commodity validators there. For Cosmos chains, for listeners who aren't familiar, you have a very different validator set. On most chains, you have somewhere between 100 to 150 on the high end validators in the active voting set. And these validators are also pretty sophisticated operators. They often validate 10, 20, 30 different Tendermint blockchains. They're often staffed, run by people who have a decade of DevOps experience, who can sort of tell you what's going on with their node just by a quick peek at a Grafana dashboard. And so these people are pretty sophisticated, and a lot of protocols ask them to do things that you might not want to ask an Ethereum you might not want to ask an Ethereum validator or all Ethereum validators to do. So Axelar is a great example of this. To participate on Axelar as a validator, you need to run nodes for other chains that Axelar is connected to. It's how Axelar functions as a cross-chain bridge is it requires validators to participate in these like voting committees. And so that's an idea that other Cosmos chains take to apply that to the MEV supply chain. So imagine rather than having Ethereum validators always just be dumb recipients of a bid in an auction, that they could actually say run an auction themselves, or they could compute some routes in a DEX that might be built into the protocol that would allow them to capture cyclic arbitrage themselves. Things like that. So generally, taking this idea of a very dumb validator and flipping it on its head and saying, okay, like we already require our validators to not be dumb, and we already have some vetting from the community and from the core dev team that these validators are aligned long term with the health and the goals of the protocol, that we should ask them to do a little more. And oftentimes you can actually use the rules of consensus to ensure that they're fulfilling those additional roles in the MEV supply chain in the way that you might want them to. So I don't know if I fully answered your question there, but I think a lot of this comes from this place of saying, one, our validators are like socially aligned with us for the long term. We already trust them to represent the community in governance, which plays a very, very significant role in Cosmos. I don't know how significant it is in Ethereum, but in Cosmos, governance decides where chains spend their money. It decides when upgrades happen to the protocol, what upgrades are and aren't allowed to happen, and broadly what the developers prioritize on their roadmap. So we're already trusting them. And so why don't we, and we're already requiring them to do more in a lot of different ways. So why don't we extend those same ideas to MEV and to try to make MEV within the bounds of our protocol? The same way, we have what transaction type is within the bounds of our protocol, or like when finalization happens, or what specific version of Tendermint we're using is all that's all up to the chain. And so we just try to take those ideas and apply them to the MEV supply chain as well.
You did answer my question perfectly there. And I think it is like a big difference, sort of just observing the perspective of MEV and Ethereum versus Cosmos is in MEV on Ethereum, the protocol is taken as a set thing. Whereas in Cosmos, my observation is that oftentimes the protocol is actually thought of as sort of a stakeholder in that MEV value chain, and parameters can be changed in order to give the user a more desirable experience. So maybe, Henry, this is a good sort of segue to you here as the leader of an app chain. I would love to kind of hear some of your design principles. And maybe if you could just touch, I know we're going to talk quite a bit about privacy later, but if you could just touch on some of the, privacy-driven user experiences that you can sort of start to create on Penumbra.
Yeah. So one thing that's kind of interesting about Penumbra is that we've sort of like walked backwards into MEV in that we didn't, unlike Barry, I didn't start out doing like searching on Ethereum or something. I started out actually doing like ZK infrastructure, like, how do you build private stuff? I was working in Zcash. And the sort of origin story for Penumbra comes from a very different place of like, how do you build a project that has privacy in it that people are going to use because it's better and not just because it's like a private X. And that ends up intersecting with MEV through this angle of like, if you're not disclosing information about your activity, then other people can't be exploiting that. So Penumbra looks quite different than I think most other chains because it has this extra dimension of which data is private and which data isn't. One of the insights that we had through thinking about this problem of okay, what does it mean to build a private DEX? Once you've zoomed in on that, it's like, okay, here's an initial use case. What does that even mean? Does that mean like make literally everything private, like run everything inside of snarks, like don't disclose anything at any time to anyone? No, because it turns out that's not actually useful. If you look around at pretty much any useful blockchain, the reason that it's useful, the reason that it's valuable is because of its shared public state, right? Like the reason that Ethereum is so valuable is not because of like all of the like great technical decisions that were made in 2014. It's because it has this like accumulated mass of like users and state that can all be interacted with. And so the challenge for building something that's private is like, okay, once you've added this new kind of design access of what information is disclosed to whom, how do you manage the interaction between the kind of public shared state and the private per user state? Because what you don't actually want sort of everything to be private. What I want is to actually, it's almost like recovering the same privacy story as like TradFi, where like somebody can't like log on to my brokerage account and build a dashboard of my P&L. That's insane. But also keeping the benefits of DeFi, where you have this kind of like real-time transparency of the aggregate state of the system. You have real-time accounting on all of the system invariants. How do you keep that for the aggregate pieces, but retain, privacy for each individual user's contribution to that overall shared state? And so for Penumbra, we've ended up with an architecture that has like a pretty explicit segmentation between here's the kind of public aggregate state and here's the private per user state. And that puts us in a pretty different position relative to a lot of other chains, just in like sort of, how is this thing put together? And so for the, just coming back to the original question, for the MEV context, I think it's kind of interesting because it's very, currently very specialized, like fixed functionality. It does a DEX, that's it, for the moment. But in that narrow scope, there's this kind of like end-to-end idea of protocol design, right? Like one kind of, personal opinion is I sort of hate the term like MEV supply chain, because to me, it feels like, okay, that's just like protocol design, right? Like what you're talking about, what people talk about when they talk about the MEV supply chain is like, what is the whole like, sequence of steps between, an end user's intent and then like tracing their actions as they're affected on the system and as the user learns about them. But like, that's actually just like the protocol, right? Like the protocol doesn't stop at the edge of the full node boundary. You should think of it in this kind of holistic way as going all the way out to the user. And I guess the sort of meta perspective that I have there is that like, it in some ways in that if you're, I wouldn't say that I'm like really like part of the Ethereum community, but as my outsider perspective on it is that the sort of the ossification at the like base layer, like drives all of the innovation, into, okay, it has to have a different label because then, it can be a thing that people can build and evolve and change over time. But really that just is the Ethereum protocol, right?
I'm in agreement with you, Henry, on that. I think it's been very difficult this season in trying to be focused on MEV. It's been pretty wildly difficult actually to parse out what is MEV versus exactly what you just said, what is protocol design. I'd love to maybe kind of try to parse out from what you were saying. The other thing that really resonated with me is, where sometimes I think about from the Ethereum perspective, people tend to think about economics. For instance, if you read something like Dan Elitzer's The Uni Chain is Inevitable, people tend to talk about MEV in sort of economic extraction type terms. Whereas my experience with talking about AppChain developers or sort of the Cosmos in general is actually building it into the user experience. So could you help translate, Henry, some of the design of Penumbra into a better experience for users of the DEX?
Yeah, so I guess like one example is on Penumbra, the DEX runs on a kind of frequent batch auction style model. And part of that is for technical reasons about how do you have interaction between public and private state. It's a lot easier if you do that as part of a batch, because if you think about, somebody submits a trade on Uniswap, right? When they sign that transaction and submit it, they're not also signing over like, and here are the exact state of the reserves of the Uniswap contract, and therefore this is the exact amount of output that I get, right? Like there's this kind of late binding where when that transaction is formed has like, here's the slot that gets filled in by the chain state, and then when I send it to the network, then it actually gets executed. But in a private context, the way that you achieve privacy on a blockchain is by removing all of the execution off-chain onto the end user device and having them submit, like, here's a proof of this new state that I've constructed. And so in doing that, you lose the ability to have this kind of like late binding property. And to recover it, you have to move to this like asynchronous model where like, oh, I'm going to make a swap and I'll somehow sort of freeze the state of my, the swap that I'm trying to make. And then later the chain will figure out what the execution price was, and I'll be able to like resume that computation. And so once you're in that kind of async model, it's just much easier to think about it in a batched way. So that's kind of the technical, weeds of why we did that. But there's also, I think, this like pretty powerful and intuitive kind of economic argument, which is, look, if you think about what a blockchain is doing, it's coming to consensus on transactions, right? And it comes to consensus on transactions in batches, and we call the batches blocks for basically historical reasons. So why is it that we have economic mechanisms on the chain that assume a kind of like finer notion of time or causality than you're actually getting out of the underlying consensus mechanism, right? Well, once you do that, then of course there's this kind of like bullshit mechanical arbitrage race to like, oh, I got to be at the top of the block because that's how I'm going to like, get at this mechanism. But, if you have a mechanism that has like consensus in batches, then your economic mechanisms should also be operated at like the same kind of time resolution. We took that to heart for Penumbra. And so as a result, we don't really have any like meaningful notion of like intra-block ordering. Technically you can go to the block and say like, look, the transactions were in this order, but all of the meaningful execution is happening in batches. And so it doesn't really matter as a user, at what position in the block was my transaction included. Either, if I'm making a swap, it's going to get executed in a batch and I'll get a common clearing price. Or if I'm doing liquidity provision, we process all of the, we have this like phased execution process for the DEX where it's like, okay, go open all the newly opened positions, like execute all the swaps, like arb everything back to consistent prices, close all the positions that were requested to be closed. And so it's kind of this like stepwise, like batched execution for each of those different participants. And so at that point, the only like real sort of block producer choice is just like, do I include something in a block or not? And that even, without having any privacy, having that mechanism design, I think really changes what the MEV landscape looks like. Because, not only are you just only able to control, like, what does this, like, is this transaction going to go in a block or not? But because all of the mechanisms are operating in batches, the marginal effect of including that transaction or not on the overall outcome is, like 1 out of n, by like whatever the like size of the, like if you have some giant whale transaction, then including it or not maybe makes a bigger difference. But as a, if I'm a normal user making a normal size trade, somebody who's doing block reduction and choosing like, should I, include this transaction or censor it? That choice has a pretty marginal effect on the overall economic outcome of that block. And so I think that really like cuts down a lot of the like, sort of classical MEV, where it's, MEV where the block producer actually has some kind of structural privileged position to exploit, extract value. And that's something that kind of comes from having this sort of like fully batched design.
So we don't work with Penumbra, full disclosure, though we wouldn't mind doing that. We work with a lot of the other dexes in Cosmos that make meaningfully different trade-offs and design decisions, not just around ordering and inclusion, but also by extension, right? Like the value proposition that they're trying to offer to users and to builders on their chains. So one of the folks that we work really closely with is the Osmosis core team and the community there. And Osmosis is very different than Penumbra insofar as they have Uni V2 style pools and concentrated liquidity style pools, and soon we'll have an order book provided by Astroport, and some lending protocols through Mars that do actually have significance for transaction ordering. So on Osmosis DEX, if you're the first transaction in a block, you're going to have a different operating against a pool. You're going to have a different price than the second or the third, in the same way you might with Ethereum. And when we talk to the community and the core team there, that's something that they view as important right now for composability reasons. That having that transaction level granularity allows folks who are building on that chain to build smart contracts and sort of extend the platform in ways that you can have transaction by transaction interlocking and interaction. Might be more difficult or might just look very different in a protocol that's more focused on privacy. And so when we work with them, they still want the protocol to try to be opinionated about trying to recapture some of the value that leaks from user transactions as a result. So one of the biggest sources of MEV in Ethereum, because transaction ordering matters there, and also on Osmosis for the same reason, is atomic arbitrage and backrunning. So a whale comes and makes a large swap against some kind of pool, pushes the price of one token to be very high, and then that creates an opportunity where a trader can trade against a set of 3 pools that have some overlapping assets that then rebalances the prices of all of them. So and this happens potentially because instead of it happening sort of at the end of a block, because prices be different, this happens potentially every transaction. So, but the Osmosis community sees this, and they saw this as an opportunity to try to create a new source of revenue for the chain. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to say, okay, we want the protocol to try to recapture some of this MEV from backrunning. We don't want to front run users. So we don't want to force the whale to pay their worst price possible and then take the money from them. But after they've paid whatever price they'll pay as a result of using their front end router, then they wanted the protocol to come in and to actually check the protocol itself, to check rather than a searcher, whether there are any backrunning opportunities and to capture them. So we built a module for them, which is basically an extension of the chain's application logic called ProtoRev, which is short for protocol revenue because we're bad at naming things, that does this, right? That takes a look at a few potential cyclic arbitrage routes after every swap and then flash mints tokens to capture an opportunity if it sees one, and flash burns those tokens, and then returns that money to the community pool. And we talked with a lot of people on Osmosis about this decision of saying, okay, well, like we could build this. This could actually just be like a router that maybe gives some users better prices as opposed to like coming in and back running them. It could be, a service that we run sort of just as an auction for off-chain searchers. And the thing that we heard from the community was, we want this. What we care about right now is not giving users in the short term better prices, but is creating more value for the community. And we think that there are other ways we're going to improve routing for users later on. So we want to do this. So we went ahead and built that out for them. And it's interesting, like we got a lot of pushback from people in Ethereum when we were doing this. They were like, oh, like the protocol shouldn't do anything like searching. Like there's no way, those algorithms are so complicated. Like it'll never run in protocol. Like it'll be so gas inefficient. Like how is this ever going to work? And then we were like, I don't know, like we'll see. And we actually did a bunch of data analysis initially, and we realized the vast majority of cyclic arbitrage was from like 4 routes on Osmosis, like the vast majority, like 80, 90%. And all of it basically settled to Osmo or Atom, which the community obviously loved because those are the tokens that they want to hold. And it was very easy to build using the tools of AppChains into the protocol, a way where we can say, okay, like we're just going to check these routes. We're also going to have some mechanism by which we can maybe add new routes, which is potentially interesting. And we're going to, every block, we're going to have like gating to ensure that, okay, if actually like somebody tries to grief this and they submit a bunch of really tiny swaps, or they, somehow like there's just Osmosis blows up, there's thousands of transactions again, everybody's printing money, it's a bull market. Like we have circuit breakers that just turn it off in case there's issues with that. And very, very conservative with how much computation we put in the protocol. And even still, like it's recapturing tens of thousands of dollars a month for the community on a pretty small number of transactions. And they can upgrade that to say, actually, we want to give the users back that money. They can upgrade that to say, okay, we want to pay validators who, are running these expensive machines, or they can just say, hey, we want to give that money back to LPs. So that's one of the really nice things about Cosmos and about using the tools of consensus in the way Henry's been talking about, is that now the community actually gets to decide what the hell we're going to do with this revenue, or what the hell we're going to do with the protocol, instead of it just being purely a question of, all right, like who is paying the validator the most as a bribe, or who's the fastest, or whatever it might be. Now we've sort of brought that into the design decision, and then users can vote with their feet, right? They can say, okay, I want privacy, so I'm going to go to Penumbra, or I actually think that this frequent batch auction mechanism is better for me. It makes more sense. I'm going to go to Penumbra. Or they can say, I know Osmosis, I'm going to stay here. Whatever it might be, people can actually, developers can make choices based on what they think their users want, and users can make explicit choices about how they want, not just MEV, but to Henry's point, like the entire spectrum of the user experience of participating in the blockchain to work. So I think MEV is like one part of this, and AppChain developers are very concerned about this whole experience, because they can be. Like you can't build what Henry's building in Ethereum and have the same tools at your disposal. So why would you have an opinion about how transactions get ordered? You're like, well, that's just given to me. I need to figure out how to work around that. But Cosmos, you can actually say, like, fuck that. I don't like the way it works. Like, we're going to have it work in a completely different way. And there's a nice framework around it, so it's pretty easy to do.
To add on to that point about the gas, like once you break out of this mode where, oh, everything that I have to do has to be like run, inside of this, like the same execution environment as all of this like random untrusted code, there's a lot of flexibility that you can have. If you're writing like a native module or component of the chain, you're now just like writing software, and you can make that software fast in ways that are not possible for this kind of fully generic kind of VM thing, especially at a VM where you're constrained by all of these legacy design decisions, right? So as an example for Penumbra, we do cycle R detection as part of the protocol, but when we're going and like having the chain go and look to see whether there's any mispricing that needs to be corrected, we can just like do a like big like graph traversal where we explore every branch of the decision tree in like a parallel fork of the chain state, and do all of this like multi-core stuff. It's all native Rust code. Like actually computers are pretty fast. And so the being in an environment where it is possible for somebody to kind of control each layer of the stack, I think causes there to be a lot more openness to like, oh, what if we just didn't do that? Or like, this isn't actually a given. This is just a thing that we made up. And we could do a different thing, potentially with a lot more effort, right? So there's always that trade-off of like, how much additional effort are you going to spend versus like, what kind of control do you get? But I think that there is more of an idea of like, the software that the chain runs is actually, the thing that we're creating and not just this given thing.
Hey guys, quick break from the show here. I want you to imagine something for me. Imagine swapping 2 stablecoins on chain, paying $0 in gas, and instead getting a rebate of $2,000. This is something that's actually happened on chain. To understand how, I want to introduce and thank this season's sponsor, Rook. Zooming out for a second, the current state of affairs at MEV is billions of dollars so far have been extracted from users' pockets using MEV. Rook is coming in and saying enough is enough. Blockchain should drive value to their users and the applications they use. It is time to leave the hobbyist era behind us if we want to move forward and we want to get this right. That's why Rook has built a custom blockchain settlement network, and it's one that gives you full control over the entire transaction lifecycle. Today, you can connect to an open source Rook node. The Rook protocol will automatically match, bundle, and auction your orders and transactions in seconds with zero gas overhead. Also, any MEV that's discoverable along the way will be returned to you, the user. Created as a collaboration between the industry's top mechanism designers and MEV engineers, Rook was built from the ground up to be scalable, safe, and programmable. You can get your own mempool, choose searchers and builders, and link your mempool with others to discover even more MEV. You can define how the MEV is shared and delivered as well. And Rook can basically process anything from transactions to meta transactions and more. This is the way that blockchains basically should have been from day one. So if you're a user listening to this, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to your wallets, go to your favorite app, your node provider, and say, hey, I want you to be working with these guys, Rook. I want the MEV that I create to be redistributed back to me. If you're a developer and you want to stay ahead of the game, the best way to do that is to follow them on Twitter. They are at Rook. Or even better yet, slide into their DMs. They are lightning responsive. They'll get you set up today. And if you do slide into those DMs, as always, please tell them that I sent you.
Completely in agreement, guys. And I think that was one of the ideas that I want to dig into, just in terms of chains being allowed to have their own opinion. So maybe in the case of something like Osmosis and the ProtoRev module that you've helped develop, Barry, at Skip, we think backrunning is okay, and we want some of those proceeds to flow to the protocol itself. Or in the case of Penumbra, we really care about privacy, and that's why we want to trade on Penumbra, and just building that into the user experience. I want to shift here because I think the question of sovereignty and owning these decisions becomes very interesting in the world of kind of the interchain. And this is where maybe I want to dive a little bit into cross-domain MEV. So we've talked about this a little bit in Ethereum, specifically within the context of layer 2s and rollups on Ethereum. That to me looks a little bit, there are definitely parallels that you could draw to the Cosmos, right? Where you kind of, instead of having everything being composable on ETH main chain, you have many different rollups, and suddenly you're entering kind of this asynchronous environment that looks very similar to what Cosmos looks like today. And I actually got super excited about, I'm sure people have been thinking about this for years, but the first time I really started to get excited about cross-domain MEV was the Atom 2.0 white paper that, Sam Hart helped to write. I know he's with you guys at Skip that, Barry. But I would love to sort of get your guys' thoughts in general about, just maybe as a jumping off point, about cross-domain MEV. Just what are your kind of thoughts as a high level? Is it this kind of interesting opportunity? Is it more technically unfeasible than people think? And then I want to kind of get into, this idea of sovereignty in this world.
So I can give my high level take very quickly, which is I think a lot of cross-domain MEV. So there's you can mean broadly maybe two things, which is one might be executing an arbitrage strategy where one leg of that strategy is on one chain or one market, another chain is on another, or another leg is on another chain or in another market. And I think that's usually what people mean. And then number two is you could mean specifically actually doing these things, but more complex versions of them, and we can somehow get atomicity across these chains. I think atomicity is a big thing that people get interested and excited about. I'd say one on the first one. So we do a lot of data collection today in Cosmos to try to understand, okay, how large is the cross-chain arbitrage opportunity? Like, is it worthwhile to try to build the kind of complicated systems that you might need to get pure, honest to God cross-chain atomicity, which do look very, very complicated as you get more into it. And what we've seen is the vast majority of arbitrage is sex to dex. So the vast majority of even for Cosmos tokens, which are on average less liquid on centralized exchanges than big Ethereum tokens are, and traded in many different venues on different chains throughout the Cosmos ecosystem, centralized to decentralized exchange arbitrage is still much larger. And like what happens is a centralized exchange moves, and then all of these different chains will, in their local markets, follow, like move towards what that centralized exchange is, except for Osmo and Osmosis, where the centralized exchange usually follows Osmosis just because the liquidity is so much deeper on Osmo. So like, I think at a high level, like people are really, really excited about this. I think it's a long ways off. And I think this will probably be the case for a long time, because as a trader, if you have a continuous time market that you're trading against, or if you have the choice between a continuous time market with really deep liquidity and a not continuous time market where you're going to have to lock in your order for a longer period of time and liquidity on average is lower, and there's a lot of bespoke things depending on which chain you're trading against, you're going to see mostly people just continuing to do this sex dex arbitrage for a while, and like that's okay. So like I think on one hand, like crypto Twitter needs to like chill out about cross domain and cross chain MEV and like think more about realizing that like Binance is the most important chain in the world right now as far as arbitrage goes. So that's one big thing. I think what we like to think about more just on a day-to-day basis at Skip is ways we can build cross-chain systems that make multiple chains feel like one chain by leveraging off-chain actors to do interesting or difficult tasks that occur at the boundaries of different chains. So this might mean, performing some kind of cross-chain swap where all you want to do is sign one transaction. You have one kind of token on chain A and you want to end up with a different token on chain B, and you don't want to have to worry about how it gets there. You just want like whatever the canonical version of the token is. I think there's a lot of interesting things around pushing complexity to off-chain actors. We were talking about the boundaries of chains. It also be much simpler things, which is just like, hey, I have this transaction that I want to execute on Juno or on Neutron or something, and I don't have the gas token there. So like, can somebody execute it for me? And I will pay you, right? So like, there's a lot of UX things that we try to spend our time thinking about, because I think those things are real right now. And there's a whole question around relayer incentivization that we could talk about, IBC relayers or other kind of cross-chain messaging protocol relayers, which are important and in many protocols fully unincentivized, who could get up to malicious MEV things or could maybe be leveraged in the MEV supply chain, if we want to call it that, to like, again, continue to improve UX. So I like to reframe this as like, from cross-chain arbitrage to this question of what are the problems, like what are the UX problems that arise when you exist in a world where users are sometimes going to be on one chain and sometimes going to be on another chain, and how can we use off-chain actors to solve those, as opposed to just like, if I could control state on like Arbitrum and on Ethereum, mainnet, like how rich can I be? Which is like probably honestly not that rich right now. But I'll pause there.
Completely agree with everything that you said, Barry. And actually that specific point about sex to dex arbitrage is definitely been something that we've been focusing on a lot this season. And the fact is that price discovery happens on Binance now. So that's by virtue of that being the fact, that's where most of the arbitrage is sort of available. But let's sort of take your point and go run with that here and say, okay, on something like in the Cosmos ecosystem where we have many of these different chains that have sort of these different rules and opinions, we want to find a way for users to we want to abstract that complexity away. And I think that's where I kind of want to dive into this point, because I think rollups on Ethereum are kind of undergoing that same battle right now, where it's a very, very analogous sort of situation where users don't want to have to think about the fact that, I have to migrate in between something like Optimism and Arbitrum, and I want some sort of communication and standards of interoperability. And that also kind of gets into where that's really manifesting in Ethereum right now, is this discussion around decentralizing the sequencer set or shared sequencer sets, right? And there are obvious implications for cross-domain MEV there. And this is what I really wanted to ask both of you here. There's very interesting, we had this exact same conversation in Ethereum land on rollups. And the question that I think Hasu asked Robert Miller was, is it the fate, the inevitable fate of every blockchain to be influenced by the sequencing of another chain? And I wanted to get your guys' perspective on that. And maybe Barry, I could pick on you first here, because this is where that idea of sovereignty comes in. That's very core to the philosophy and ethos of Cosmos, is having an opinion or being sovereign and not being impacted by the decision of other chains. But to your point, as you kind of move in and try to increase the interoperability in between all of these other chains, to what degree is it appropriate to be beholden to the decision that other chains make? At what point are you giving away some of your sovereignty, in favor of compatibility? I would love to know, what you think about that tension.
I'm happy to try to answer that, but I actually think maybe a more interesting first version of this question is to turn it on Henry and just sort of hear, Henry, your thoughts on, could Penumbra be a rollup? Could it participate, regardless of whether it's a rollup? Would you use a shared sequencer? How would you think about these things? How do you guys think about sequencing relative to what your product is and the value proposition you're trying to offer users? And then maybe I can try to give my answer, but I feel like Henry has more appropriate, more thoughts.
Oh, I mean, I don't know that I have a super big take on this. I guess I feel like the boundaries of what is an L1, what is an L2, what is a rollup, I don't know. I think there's various technical aspects that you could point to distinguish all of those things, but it's not clear to me how much that matters to the end user experience. And I think from the end user perspective, having a bunch of different L2s actually does look a lot like having a bunch of different chains, because all that an L2 is a distinct chain that has some kind of special way to anchor itself to another chain. One thing that I think is kind of underappreciated about IBC is that IBC is actually this very, very flexible and generic sort of cross-chain timestamping system as a side effect of doing messaging, right? So in IBC, you have chain A and chain B, and they're running some kind of clients of each other. But what that means is that chain A is going to have inside of its state, here is my view as chain A of the chain B state. But the chain B state also includes hey, as chain B, here's my view of chain C or chain D or whatever. And so you end up with this picture where it's almost like you have one big sort of meta blockchain that has all of these localized little neighborhoods. And from each one, you can verify state anywhere else in the ecosystem, but potentially with some kind of like light cone of verification where, until this has been relayed across however many different pieces, I haven't pulled those latest changes of, chain B or C, D, E, whatever, into my sort of like local like cone of verifiability. And from that perspective, like what is a rollup, what is not. I'm not saying that the trust distinctions are not meaningful, but I would say that they're not the only thing that matters. I do think that there is a kind of interesting future where, and a thing that we're hoping to build into Penumbra, where we generalize it to be more of a kind of interchain privacy layer, where you take the kind of asynchronous ZK execution that we built just for the one use case of having a native DEX, and then expand that to like, well, why can't I interact with the public chain state of, say, Osmosis or Ethereum or whatever, from the shielded pool of Penumbra, right? And so I think that in the long term, what it looks like in Ethereum, what it looks like in Cosmos, there's going to be some kind of convergent evolution, because a lot of the problems end up being like fundamentally the same. I think that like IBC between rollups seems like a really obvious thing to do, because it turns out that like one of the hardest parts of doing cross-chain messaging is not actually just the like how do you verify the state root part, but also like how do you have like n different chains all agree on common data formats, right? And that's the part that is like not very like cool and sexy, and we're doing this like awesome like moon math to make it work. It's like, how do I like parse a protobuf? But that actually is like also a quite hard engineering problem. And so I think that there's definitely going to be some kind of convergence in the future there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think like it's kind of like interesting being a little bit removed from the center of a lot of Ethereum's rollup conversations and rollup proliferation stuff today, but living in Cosmos, because like when Ethereum people talk about this stuff, they're like, oh, like we can have like atomic cross-chain like sequencing and like you'll be able to start a flash loan on one chain and end it on a different chain and like all these things. And I'm like, you guys have no idea how hard like basic shit is about to get for you if you don't have good standards. And you're gonna have like you have like the old meme about like 1,000 different standards are gonna arise. And I think like when you talk to Cosmos people, they're always like, yeah, like the basic shit is what you should really focus on. And if you get that right, like you're gonna start to have more users and better user experience. So you're gonna build up from there. So I think it'll be interesting to see this all play out. Like Henry, I think one of my big takes is a lot of this stuff is going to start to look more like Cosmos, which I think will be fun, and we'll have some exciting things to hopefully share and to teach based on what we've learned in a multi-chain world. To touch on the question of like, is it the fate of all blockchains to be influenced by the sequencing of another chain? I would mostly just say I hope not. Like that seems bad. Like there's this. I think like there's this vision of having a single chain that can is like the hub of MEV and block building, and where searchers go and where users go to express their intents, which that's a really hard social coordination problem. It's a hard technical problem. It's I think it's like roughly in line with the swap idea, right? I think it's a pretty cool vision. I think probably with the version of this that we're most interested in is one that is much more limited, I'd say. much more opt-in and much more focused on sovereignty, where, when it is economically reasonable and good for chains to coordinate, they may choose to do so for brief periods of time with somewhat limited guarantees. And that I think a lot of this cross-chain coordination is going to happen over something that looks like IBC. I don't know if it's the fate of all chain. I really don't think it is. Like, I think these takes usually overestimate the value of coordination, or actually probably underestimate the cost of any kind of coordination. Like if there is a one chain that is like helping to sequence a large percentage of Ethereum blocks and Arbitrum blocks, perhaps that chain is going to have to do a lot of really different weird shit to sequence Penumbra blocks. And Penumbra validators are going to have to think it's like really important for them to participate to opt into that chain, and like they're going to have other things that they're thinking about as well. So I'm generally quite skeptical of those kinds of mechanisms, and I think the part of this vision that I do think is most interesting is around the idea of intents, insofar as maybe having a place you go to express, hey, I want to go buy this NFT on another chain, and I want it to transfer to a third place, or I want to go to my special NFT wallet. And because basic stuff can become challenging in a cross-chain world, I think like simple intent fulfillment, where an off-chain actor can come and say, okay, I'm going to make this happen for you. Like, you give me the permissions, or maybe in Henry's model, like people who care about privacy, just being able to go to Penumbra and say, hey, I want to make this swap on this other DEX, or I want to go do this, or I want to transfer my tokens between these two chains. Like, that experience of having one place they go actually does seem really, really good to me. And that's pretty exciting long term. That's a little bit less about sequencing. And though the like sequencing layer does matter a lot there. But we try to be very oriented, as I said, towards this vision of like, okay, what gets hard when you have a lot of chains, and like, how can we use some of the tools that people usually associate with MEV to help fix those problems?
I guess one other thing I would add is on this, there's sort of this question of, okay, what does it mean to actually be influenced, right? Which is another sort of way where, depending on your reading of the question, you could end up with like quite different answers. Either you have a kind of a more minimal sense of like a more literal like protocol sequencing, like, is this chain really being sequenced by this other one? And I think the cost of doing that coordination may actually be quite high, as per Barry's point. But if you're talking about a more general kind of like economic influence, then, in some sense, like, the answer is, I think, always yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that something isn't a sovereign chain, or if it does mean that, then, no chain is sovereign. Like, in some sense, you could say like, look, ETH has this other consensus mechanism, which is that, Circle decides like what the canonical ETH chain is. And if they want to have a different ETH chain, then like, that's kind of going to be a big deal. And people have had, this is not obviously a new insight, right? Like, there's a lot of discussions about like, okay, what does it mean to have, so much of the economic value be tied to these like off-chain deposits held by some actor. But if you're stepping away from the kind of very literal like protocol sequencing question of, what does it mean for one thing to influence another thing, then you can already see those discussions that are happening about like off-chain assets as being another instance of that same kind of dilemma.
Yeah, I guess you could take this all the way up to its highest sort of philosophical level and say, is anything that exists, at least in our world, truly independent of something else? Even at the highest level, something like the US has its full sovereignty, right? But we are also somewhat dependent on what other nation states in the world do. And I guess you got to kind of map that analogy to blockchains and say, where does, how do you draw that line, right? Like, I know there's a lot of focus on kind of the fork choice rule as something that's sort of a technical requirement, but then there's also, there are also sort of softer economic reasons to be influenced by other chains. Guys, I want to make sure we could, I'm sure, keep going, talk about this for another 2 full hours, but I would love to, just because we're a little time constrained here, just get your thoughts on sort of privacy. And maybe, Henry, I could call on you here. I know you've sort of brought up ABCI 2, I think is the, the upcoming change. And could you maybe just give an overview of what that is, why it's an important development, and then maybe segue into some of the sort of cool implications that has for privacy, at least on Penumbra?
Yeah. So ABCI is an API that was made originally for communication between Tendermint and the Cosmos SDK. But the idea when they made it was, well, rather than doing the thing that like pretty much everybody else did in like the sort of 2017, 2018 cycle of coupling the consensus engine to the chain, what if we decoupled those things and said, we're going to have a generic interface for here's the application that's replicated by the consensus mechanism, and here's the consensus mechanism itself, and those things can be somewhat distinct. So that's the point of ABCI. It's making the consensus engine pluggable. And in the first version of ABCI, which is what's currently used in Cosmos, the consensus engine is basically like telling the app, okay, here's the stuff that occurred. And that's just a given, right? And that is very useful just for, being able to ship a chain and so on. But there's a lot of cool stuff that you could do if you had the app have some way to extend hooks down into the consensus stack. And so there's been an ongoing project, first called ABCI++, and for various reasons got kind of re-split up and renumbered into ABCI 1, ABCI 2. And basically those changes provide additional hooks for the application to have greater control over what's going on at the consensus layer. So there's two big things that you can do. One is this idea of prepare or process proposal, which is the idea that instead of just having the consensus engine deliver to the app, like here's stuff that occurred, deal with it. You could give the app a way to control, what block a validator is going to propose, or whether a validator is going to vote up or down on a particular proposal. So you can think of this as kind of being like almost like a native way to do PBS, but where you're having the application actually also be a block builder. And maybe the app chooses to delegate that to some, off-chain actor or something, or maybe it chooses to do parts of the block building itself. But by having that interface, the application can kind of have full control of like exactly what it wants to do there. So as you can imagine, that's already quite powerful. But the second really cool thing that is coming later in ABCI 2 is this idea of vote extensions, which is basically a way to have each validator who's participating in the consensus process include some extra data as a kind of extension to their vote of, do I, approve of this block or not? And that means that you can have the validator set also be performing MPC. So you can have the validator set do like, oh, we're going to do a key generation, or we're going to do like threshold decryption. And this is really powerful because now, going all the way back to the beginning of the episode, one of the things Barry mentioned was this idea of like, you have these validators and the validators can do more things, right? Part of that is because the validators are not just socially aligned, but also more economically aligned with the chain. Like you can slash them with more impact than you could do on Ethereum, say. But the point is that, you have these actors and they're acting on behalf of the chain. And so you can ask them to do more stuff. And in particular, you could ask them to do some kind of like online, coordinated cryptography that you couldn't necessarily have each individual user participating in because like, maybe I just want to send my transaction, or maybe I, would be open to doing some fancy cryptography, but like my Wi-Fi cut out. And so I'm, not participating anymore and so on. All these things that make it difficult to sort of push that computation out to the end user. You can have the validators act as like, here is this like, committee of participants who are economically and socially aligned with the protocol. And so we can get them to do useful stuff. And threshold crypto is, I think, the most obvious, coolest example of this. So in the future, Cosmos chains are going to be able to do threshold encryption for transactions so that you can do some committed reveal type execution. And for Penumbra, we can actually take that a step further and build something that we call flow encryption, which is a way to encrypt not the entire transaction, because for us the transaction is already shielded, so it's already not revealing a lot of information about who is doing it or what. But maybe somebody wants to interact with the public state, like I want to make a trade, right? Using flow encryption, we can say we want to have these sort of flows of value between different parts of the system. Like here's value that's flowing into a batch swap, or here's value that's flowing into delegations to some validator or so on. And we want to be able to have the system see only the aggregate, but not be able to see any individual user's contribution to that flow. And we can do that using threshold encryption, where the threshold encryption is also additively homomorphic and verifiable. So in my transaction, I can prepare this encrypted contribution of like, here's my amount that I'm going to put into this batch swap. And once all of those transactions get included in a block, the validators can sum up all of the encrypted contributions of everybody's batch swaps, and then decrypt only the batch total. And so now I and everybody else who's in the same batch as me get like not just this sort of commit and reveal privacy up until inclusion, we get a much stronger like long-term privacy, because the only data that's publicly revealed is the aggregate of all of our user intent. So it's sort of a way to have private coordination between all the users of the system without even them having to interact with each other.
And Henry, just because honestly, it's probably a little criminal that we haven't discussed threshold encryption and the implications that much on Ethereum so far. Could you just underline again for the listener why the way that it's done on Penumbra is like very different from the way that it's done on Ethereum today? And maybe if you could talk about sort of the information advantage that Decryptor gets on Ethereum, just to specifically underscore the MEV implication of that as well.
On Ethereum or some other place where you have this kind of transaction by transaction granularity, and the transaction is this kind of generic blob of execution. Basically, the only thing you can do with threshold encryption there is encrypt the transaction's contents and effects up until the point where you're going to include it in a block. And then at that point, you decrypt it, and the whole system can see exactly what the transaction does in order to execute it. And so as a user, that threshold encryption is not giving you any long-term privacy. It's only giving you privacy up until the point that your transaction is included in a block. And that also poses some difficulties for the system, like, if you can't verify that the transaction is valid before you commit to including it, what do you do? How do you account for gas if you don't know what the contents are, etc.? On Penumbra, on the other hand, because all of the transaction contents are already shielded, except for here is this, anonymous contribution to some part of the public state. The only thing you have to encrypt is like, what is the input amount to of my transaction's contribution to some batch? And so if you're a decryptor, let's say, there's like a malicious coalition does that, the amount that you can learn by illicitly decrypting transactions is much less, right? You don't get to learn like, hey, here's exactly this particular account that's doing stuff. You don't get to see any other details other than like, this is the contribution. And it also, I think, it means that in this sort of like longer term picture, maybe a better way to say it is, when people talk about MEV and exploitation, a lot of the time it feels like they're talking about just this sort of first order thing. Because seeing how people are like, rearranging blocks they're produced is kind of the most obvious and detectable way to see that people are exploiting excess information disclosure from other people's transactions. But really, that's just the kind of the tip of the iceberg of possible kind of adversarial behavior that you could do on chain. If I can see your entire history of your trading strategy, I can probably get a lot of information to use against you, even if I'm not controlling, exactly what your transaction inclusion is, right? Like, let's say you're doing market making. I can look at all of your trades. I can see what your strategy is. Maybe I can predict like what's the 1% of the time that you're going to do a mispricing, and at that moment, come in and roll you over. And I don't need to have, control over the sequencing of your transactions to do that. I just need to be able to see your entire history. And so I think really, the current kind of discussions about MEV are really looking at just this kind of like first order effects. But even in a world where you can perfectly solve all of those with threshold encryption or SGX or, whatever else, you haven't actually really solved the problem of kind of excess information disclosure on chain. Like the dark forest is still there. It just moves up like one level of difficulty.
I completely agree there. And then I know, guys, we've got to wrap up, and it's tough because I know we could probably go for another couple hours on this, but I guess, Barry, any sort of, comment to or response to what Henry just said regarding privacy, or any just sort of anything that you want to say to bookend the conversation, or kind of a takeaway that you want to leave listeners with?
I guess on the privacy thing, I think Henry put it super well. You skip as a company from day one has been getting comparisons to Flashbots, but we try to take a very different cultural and technical approach insofar as our goal is to try to give chains more control over MEV, how it gets extracted, what gets extracted, how it gets distributed. And so that leaves us in a position where we all are and always have been very favorable to things that try to improve privacy, to try to protect users from MEV. We're going to be working on the threshold decryption schemes that Henry was talking about for Osmosis as a part of our product partnership with them. So, in general, I'm also much less qualified to speak on privacy and encryption than Henry is, so I'll leave a lot of that to him. I will say, in MEV very broadly, whether you're talking about encryption of transactions or just trying to reduce the number of actors who have access to any particular kind of information, about a trade or sort of anything related to the life cycle of a swap, there is always this trade-off between what kind of information can I give people, and how many actors am I giving that information to, versus what is the user experience that I'm going to have. And I think these things can come in tension. For example, like when we think about order flow auctions, right? There's always this question of, okay, if I have an intent to swap, I can do what MEV blocker does and just tell everybody, hey, I want to swap, this much ETH for this much DAI, like who can give me the best price possible? And we do nothing to protect that person. We do nothing to limit that information or try to obfuscate the actual intent. And then that potentially has leakage considerations for, who actually, what dexes get swapped on. And you can make that intent more specific as well. We could say, okay, I want to trade ETH for DAI on this particular exchange, or in this Uniswap pool. And that's even worse because now as a searcher can go and they can see that and they say, well, I'm not going to bid to back run you, but I'll just front run you. I know you're going to come in, you push the price up a little bit, and I'll sell after you. I can do that probabilistically. And then there are much more complicated systems that try to limit that information flow quite a bit more. So MEV share tries to say, okay, instead of just broadcasting your intent to trade to everyone, we'll allow you to program the specific piece of information that we share with searchers. By default, we won't broadcast anything, and searchers will just have to blindly submit bundles that attempt to interact with your trade. So like the order flow example, right? There's a few different ways of going about this, and the system probably produces or potentially produces better prices for users, but at the cost of this overhead of complexity, and is just more difficult for searchers to interact with. And so then the question is, where do we go with this trade-off? I think you'll see different systems make different choices. MEV blocker gets used quite a bit right now. It's very easy for people to interact with. I think a lot of the encryption work that Henry's doing, and that potentially more broadly the tools of AppChains allow you to do, kind of gets around some of this trade-off. Like the fully holomorphic encryption that Henry was mentioning means, well, actually we can just use shielded information in our computation. We don't actually have to make this black and white decision, which is pretty cool. It's like the infinity stones, we're just infinite power. So I think FHE, fully general FHE, is something that everyone in MEV is very excited about as a result, because you look at this fundamental trade-off and you're like, oh, here's a way around it. And so there's smaller, more practical pieces of that I think the Penumbra team are taking and implementing now, which is pretty cool. More broadly, if I were to say one thing I want people to walk away from the conversation with, it's that Cosmos looks like a very different ecosystem than Ethereum does, not just in terms of how MEV gets distributed and extracted, but also how people build and interact with blockchains. And Ethereum, with the proliferation of rollups, is going to start to look a lot more like Cosmos does now. And in Cosmos, you can be concerned about cross-domain MEV, but I think it's much more useful to be concerned about what is the UX that I would want to achieve, from a God's eye point of view, about how people do different things across different chains, and how can we think about MEV as improving that, and off-chain actors as being responsible for improving that, as opposed to just trying to take money from different people throughout the stack. So I think, and another thing for listeners who are mostly in Ethereum, or mostly just live in one chain or operate on mainnet, go see what it's like to interact with a bunch of different chains at the same time. Go try to take some money out on Osmosis and go to Stargaze and buy an NFT and come back to Ethereum. I think you'll find that there are things you can do that you didn't think were possible, and then there are some things that are unexpectedly frustrating. And I think that kind of experience will be very informative for how people think about and build rollups.
Guys, unfortunately, that is all the time we have. Barry and Henry, thank you guys so much for coming on. This was an amazing episode, and I'm sure our listeners will take a lot away. So thanks, guys, once again, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right. Thanks so much.